the Gemara that we learned yesterday was all about Havdalah. And the Gemara had asked this question about how did it work with the establishing this rule of Havdalah, because we sort of make Havdalah twice. We do it in the prayers, in the Ma'ariv after Shabbos. But we also say Havdalah on a cup of wine. And the truth is, Kiddush is the same thing. We do Kiddush in the prayer. We say the bracha Makadesh Shabbos. And then we go home and we recite Kiddush again as well in the house. So here the Gemara deals with two issues. Number one is, which one is the main one? Do you need to do both? And number two, the Gemara deals with the fact that if you do both, is it considered a bracha levatala and a bracha for in vain? It's like a bracha she'ena tzricha, I should say. Bracha that's not necessary. And so that's what the Gemara deals with here. Now, the first thing the Gemara tells us is that Jewish people, when the Anshe Knesset Agdola, when the men of the Great Assembly, when they established the wording of the prayers, they established that in the Ma'ariv, in the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the prayer that we recite after Shabbos, there you should insert a paragraph about Havdalah. They established that. We don't know where exactly they established it. We have an argument between the rabbis. Where exactly was it meant to be inserted? Because after they established that rule, the Jewish people, at some point later, got wealthy. And when they got wealthy, the rabbi said, you know what, let's establish Havdalah on a cup of wine. And from now on, you don't have to recite it in the prayers. And that's when it became forgotten, where originally the rabbis had told us to insert the Havdalah prayer. We forgot because we stopped doing it. It was no longer necessary to include the Havdalah in the prayers. Therefore, we stopped doing it. So therefore, the rabbis debate, where was the initial decree to include it? And then later on, it says that the Jewish people became poor again. And the rabbis, they basically did two things. They said, let's, number one, establish that the main Havdalah should be in the prayers. And at the same time, you should also recite Havdalah on a cup of wine if you have it, if you have that ability. In this way, they figured from now on, we'll never have to switch back and forth, making decrees and abolishing decrees. We could just, it's automatic. You're supposed to do both. And if you don't do, if you can't do the Havdalah on the cup of wine, all you do is the Havdalah in the prayers. And so that's how the rabbis established it. And when they established it again, it seemed unclear where exactly to insert. And that's why we have a few different opinions how exactly it's supposed to be inserted into the prayers, because they had forgotten how it was done the original first time around. Now, the Gemara afterwards brings the question of, are you really supposed to do it twice? And it seems to want to say that maybe not. Maybe you shouldn't do it twice. And because of this, we have sort of a contradiction in the Gemara, because the initial Gemara brings opinions. Reb Chia bar Abba, Reb Yochanan, the initial Gemara brings opinions that if you do it in the prayer, you still have to say it on a cup of wine. You need to do it twice. Then we had Rabbah and Rav Yosef. You need to do it twice. And these rabbis, of course, are Amoraim, and Rabba, Reb Yosef, the third generation Amoraim, and Reb Chia bar Abba, who's probably quoting, he says in the name of Reb Yochanan, he's probably quoting the Reb Yochanan, the second generation Amoira Reb Yochanan. So these are all the rabbis called the Amoraim, the time, the later rabbis, not the Tanoim who wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim who are the authors of the Gemara. And Rabba and Rav Yosef as well, they are Amoraim. They're in the third generation, and then we have Reb Binyamin bar Yefes, and Reb Binyamin bar Yefes. I don't see here. See if it's in the other. I just want to prove that these are all Amoraim, and. Let me just pull it up here.
Anybody was a time, but it wouldn't be an argument.
It's also because I have this beautiful book that I just want to take advantage of. But it doesn't have, he was not a well-known throughout the Talmud. In any event, he brings that Rabbi Yossi asked Rabbi Yochanan in Sidon, and some say Rabbi Shimon bar Yaakov from Sidon asked Rabbi Yochanan, if a person makes Havdalah in the tefillah, does he need to make Havdalah on the cup of wine? And Rabbi Yochanan answered, yes, you do have to recite Havdalah on the wine. So the conclusion of the Amoraim seems to be pretty clear that you need to do both. And what happens if you did it in the opposite order? If you did it in the opposite order, the Gemara asked, what happens then? Let's say you did the Havdalah on a cup of wine. Would you then need to recite it in the prayer? Let's say you didn't do the Havdalah, you didn't daven Ma'ariv yet, and your wife needs to go somewhere, so you make Havdalah for her, for everyone, and then you'll daven Ma'ariv later. So you made Havdalah on the cup of wine. Should you insert the paragraph in your prayer? And the Gemara says that yes, and it brings a proof from the fact that the main takana is tefillah, is the prayer havdalah. So if a person does the prayer havdalah in his prayers, he does the havdalah, even then, even though he did the main havdalah in his prayers, he still has to recite havdalah on a cup of wine, even though the main Havdalah he did. So if you only do the secondary Havdalah, which is the cup of wine Havdalah, for sure you got to do the main Havdalah. That's the Gemara's logic. So then the Gemara brought Rav Acha Aricha, who taught before Rav Chinana, and he learned a brisa. He taught a brisa before Rav Chinana. And so this is a Tana. And here he brings a statement that's a little unclear. It says that if a person makes Havdalah in the prayers, so that's greater than making Havdalah on the cup of wine, which implies that you could do either one. And if you did this one, it's better than if you did the other one. And if you did Havdalah in both, then you got a blessing on your head. And the Gemara asks, how could that be? You could do it in both. If you do it in both, that's a bracha she'ena tzricha. In other words, if you're telling me that if you do any of them, you fulfilled the mitzvah, so how could you do both then? You already fulfilled the mitzvah. And if you do it now, you're going to be transgressing a prohibition of a bracha she'ena tzricha. Now the Gemara here says, what?
We only do Chayin Adas the same way. What extra bracha is in Shemona Esrei? We don't ever say anything special for Abdullah there.
So
we say the whole speech and then we say Chayin Adas.
So the simple way of understanding the Gemara is that if you did the paragraph, even without a bracha, in the Shemona Esrei, when later you do the Havdalah on a cup of wine, you're reciting a bracha that's not necessary. So that's the simple understanding that you fulfilled your obligation already by by reciting the Havdalah in the Shemona Esrei, even though you don't say a bracha there. Still, you fulfilled that obligation. Yes, Susan.
I know this is maybe a silly question, but when you're reciting a bracha with a cup of wine, you're not obligated to drink the wine, are you?
Yes, you are obligated to drink.
Are?
Yeah, that's part of the honor of that you're reciting the.
Does it matter how much is in the cup?
So it you don't have to drink the whole cup. There's for Kiddush, a person drinks mole lugmav, a cheekful. So in any event, the Gemara here tells us that this could be an issue of reciting a bracha that's not necessary, and the Gemara uses a verse in the Ten Commandments. The verse says, "Loisisa Shem Hashem Elokecha Lashav." Don't use God's name in vain. Now, the commentary is all the debate over here. Does this mean literally you're transgressing one of the 10 commandments? Is this really using God's name in vain? I mean, you're reciting a bracha. You're saying a blessing, thanking Hashem. Blessed are you, Hashem, whose mavdil separates between kodesh, holy, and mundane. You're saying a blessing of either praise or or request. Why should this be considered, using God's name in vain? So, in other words, many of the rabbis understand this Gemara to mean that it's a rabbinic law based on that verse, but it's not a prohibition of using God's name in vain, because you're not really using God's name in vain. You're saying a nice blessing. It's just that it's not necessary. So but it's not desecrating God's name, so to speak. You're not just using God's name and throwing it around for a negative purpose. You're saying a blessing with God's name in it. It happens to be an extra blessing, and therefore the rabbis made a rule that a person is not allowed to do that. And the fact that the Gemara brings a verse, like Sisa, it's called an asmachta, something that the rabbis relied on. A verse that they relied on when they made their decree. They had a little hint from the Torah. This verse is a hint that their decree is a good decree. So therefore, they established their decree. But many of the rabbis want to learn this, that it's not biblical. On the other hand, the understanding, the simple understanding in the Rambam, Maimonides, is that he learns this literally, that a bracha she'ena tzricha, bracha that's not necessary, is considered a transgression of using God's name in vain. So there is an argument among the commentaries here. Yes, Robert.
I'm sorry if I have fallen behind on understanding, but in the Gemara that's on 33b1, again, the Shemona Esrei is 18 blessings, but we say 19 blessings, and then there's a notation that 7 blessings were enacted, 8 were not enacted. So tell me the process, the sequence of why we still call it Shemona Esrei. Again, the distinction between what was previously instituted and then what was added. I just understand the process of why
Yeah. So
we
the only
use
thing
oh,
is,
go ahead.
Robert, you're ahead of us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, that's a lead to the next thing. I apologize.
So
Okay,
we'll get to that
thank
soon.
you.
Metz Hashem, maybe even today. But yeah, we're not up to that yet. We're really in the
Okay.
page before. We're going over yesterday's
Okay, yeah,
Gemara.
right. I see the previous column where it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, everybody.
No problem. So, so in any event here, we have this brisa that implies that you don't need to do both the Havdalah in the prayer and the Havdalah on a cup of wine. And if you do it according to that, if you did both, it would be a transgression. Either, according to some opinions, it would be a rabbinic transgression. According to the Rambam, it would be a biblical transgression. Now, the Gemara answers this question by saying, no, you don't have to do both. You really just do one or the other. And whichever one you do, you get a blessing for doing one. You get a blessing on your head. The Gemara translates the brisa, the statement, a little differently than we initially understood. And it comes out that according to this new way of reading or wording the brisa, according to the new way of wording the brisa, you don't have to recite Havdalah both in your prayer and on a cup of wine. Either one is okay. And of course, the best, according to this brisa, is the prayer in the prayer, to say Havdalah in the prayer. That's the way the brisa is now worded to the way to understand the new wording of it. Now, the Gemara then asked, what happens if you made a mistake in both? And the mistake that you made is somehow you missed out both of these. You missed out, number one, reciting Havdalah in your prayer. It's common, you forget it. You forget that little paragraph to insert it. And because you forgot it in the prayer, normally it's not a problem. If you say it later on a cup of wine, no big deal. But here you forgot later in the cup of wine. You forgot later to recite it on the cup of wine, meaning what you did some type of work that contradicts that shows that you missed out in the Havdalah. What did you do? So there are two understandings here. You either ate something which is prohibited to eat or drink before Havdalah, even though for davening, we do have a leniency of people take a drink before davening. It's okay, you're allowed to. However, when it comes to Kiddush and Havdalah, we are not allowed to drink or eat before Kiddush and Havdalah. And Kiddush and Havdalah, if a person does eat before Havdalah, the law is that, according to the way our Gemara is understanding it, and this is that a person who eats, it's like he missed Havdalah. If you eat, then you missed Havdalah. So not only did you miss it in your prayers because you forgot to insert it in the prayer, you also missed it in your Havdalah, in the Havdalah on a cup of wine. Now, I should mention there is a Talmudic dispute in the Gemara Psachim about if a person tasted something and before he made Havdalah, can you still recite Havdalah on a cup of wine? And there are two opinions there. We hold that you are allowed to recite Havdalah later. But even so, even if you're allowed to recite Havdalah afterwards, it is still considered that you messed up. You are not allowed to eat first. So there is an opinion there that says that if you ate something, you cannot recite Havdalah later. You missed out. And the other opinion says you can recite Havdalah later, but you were not supposed to eat before Havdalah. And so the Gemara here is telling us that if you missed both, you missed it in the prayer and you missed it in the on the cup of wine. Let me mute everyone here. And you missed it on the cup of wine. So you really you're stuck now. The question is, what do you do now? Are you able to just recite it on the cup of wine? Or do you need to repeat the Shemona Esrei? Now, do we know anything about repeating Shemona Esrei? So the thing is that when a person forgets certain prayers to add them in the Shemona Esrei, there are some times where you have to repeat it. We know if you forget Ya'aleh v'Yavoy, if you forget to recite for Rosh Chodesh in the morning davening or the Mincha davening, you forget to say Rosh Chodesh, you generally will need to repeat the Shemona Esrei. There are other situations you forgot. Our Mishnah told us about mentioning rain and asking for rain. And the law is, what happens if you forgot to ask for rain? If you forgot to mention rain? And what is the law? The law is that, and we learned this in the Gemara on page 33a, that if a person did forget, you would need to go back if you forgot to ask for rain, meaning you mentioned the prayer in the prayers that Hashem should bless the year, and He should give blessing to the land, but you didn't say rain. You forgot to say rain, and it's during the rainy season. You would need to repeat the Shemona Esrei. You would need to go back, but normally, Havdalah, if you miss the Havdalah, you don't have to go back because you could say it on a cup of wine. What does that imply? That let's say you forgot to recite it in the prayer, and later on, you're going to recite Havdalah on a cup of wine, so you're all set. You'll say it later. You don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. But here, we have another additional point that has to be mentioned, and that is that here you ate already before you did the Havdalah. So you missed Havdalah, at least this initial stage of Havdalah. Will you be allowed to say Havdalah later? Yes, but you did something wrong by eating before Havdalah. You missed the Havdalah on the cup of wine now, and you missed it in the prayer. So the Gemara understands that you should deserve some type of a penalty, at least according to some opinions. That's the understanding here, that there's a penalty since you messed up in the prayer and in the cup of wine. So there's a penalty. The rabbis penalized one to have to repeat the prayer of Shemona Esrei and include the Havdalah in the prayer. So that's the understanding here. You made a mistake in both. So Rav Sheshes asked, Rav Chizda asked Rav Sheshes this question. You made a mistake. You missed it out in both. And Rav Sheshes answered Rav Chizda that you do have to go and repeat the Shemona Esrei, and that is the halacha. There are other ways of understanding this. Ta'a bezu ubezu, where a person forgot. Yes, Yehuda. Yes.
Yeah, I remember learning that if extenuating circumstances, you can still say Havdalah until Wednesday.
Right. The problem is that here we're dealing with another issue, and that is that do we assume someone is going to fast until Wednesday? No, Tuesday night. The Tuesday night is when Wednesday begins. So would someone fast that much? We don't assume someone's going to fast that long.
Right.
And so, the Shulchan Aruch deals with this issue. Thanks for bringing it up, Yehuda. The Shulchan Aruch does deal with this with regard to if a person doesn't have a cup of wine, what do they do? So let me read for you the in the Shulchan Aruch over here. I think this is important for us to learn. So in the Shulchan Aruch, it brings down chapter 294. So it says, when the rabbis established the wording of the prayers, they established the Havdalah in the Shemona Esrei, and not on a cup of wine, because when they left exile, when Ezra took the Jewish people out of exile, around the year maybe 350 BCE. So when they took them out of exile, so the Jews were very poor, and they weren't able to buy wine. So they established it in the bracha of Chaynein Hadas, in the bracha of knowledge. And as the Gemara explained, the two reasons why it would go in that bracha. It's wisdom to differentiate between holy and mundane, and also because it's the first blessing of the weekday, and this is the first request. It's otherwise you're not allowed to request things until before Havdalah. So they first recite Havdalah in the prayer, and then you can start including your requests. So they established Havdalah in the first blessing of the requests, so that you would first do the Havdalah and then request anything that you want, which is the prohibited on Shabbos. And then afterwards, when the Jewish people got wealthy, as our Gemara explained, the rabbis established it on a cup of wine. Then they got poor again, and the rabbi said, you know what, the main thing should be the prayer. And in order not to go back and forth, they said that you should always do it in prayer. And if you're able to find a cup of wine, you do it on wine as well. Now, how far do you have to go out of your way to get wine? So it says that if you don't expect to have wine the whole Sunday, till Sunday night, then you can rely on your Havdalah in your prayer, and you're able to eat afterwards. So even though you might get wine, you might have wine before Tuesday night, like Yehuda's asking, but since you don't expect to have wine the whole Sunday until Sunday night, so if you're not expecting to have wine, then you can rely on your Havdalah that you recited in your Ma'ariv service in the Saturday night prayer, and that Havdalah is going to be good for you, and you would be allowed to eat afterwards. And now, a person who made Havdalah on a cup of wine before they davened Ma'ariv, obviously, you need to recite the Havdalah in the Ma'ariv prayer, because that's the main part of Havdalah is in the prayer, not on the cup of wine. Person forgot, he didn't daven Ma'ariv on Saturday night. This is an interesting question. Now you're going to daven Shacharis twice. You should mention Havdalah in the second prayer, because the second prayer is the tashlumin, is the makeup for the Ma'ariv. Even though you recited it on a cup of wine, but the Havdalah in the prayer is the main one, you should really do it right. And so now you're going to recite Shacharis, the morning prayer, twice. This is a very interesting, and it's debated. This is an opinion that's debated. There are different opinions about this, but the Alter Rebbe holds, the Shulchan Aruch Harav holds that you would recite Havdalah in the second prayer, the makeup prayer. Again, if you missed Ma'ariv, let's say you fell asleep Saturday night, you already made Havdalah on a cup of wine. but you forgot to daven Ma'ariv. Now, comes Sunday morning, you got to daven Shachris twice. So what is the law? Where do you insert Havdalah in Shachris? Or do you only insert it in Ma'ariv? And if you insert it in Shachris, when do you insert it now? Do you insert it in the first prayer, which is the morning prayer, or the second prayer that you're going to recite as a makeup for the Ma'ariv? And so the Shulchan Aruch Harav, together with there are some others that agree with the Shulchan Aruch Harav, they hold that you should recite the Havdalah in the makeup prayer, because that is in place of Ma'ariv. Other opinions hold you should recite it in the first prayer, because this is the first weekday prayer that you're reciting this week. Because your Shachar, you didn't have in Ma'ariv, so this is the first prayer that you're reciting, so recite it in the morning prayer. But the Alter Rebbe holds you recite it in the second prayer because it's meant for Ma'ariv, because that's when the rabbis established it, and it was established as the main Havdalah was supposed to be in Ma'ariv, and therefore you're doing a makeup for Ma'ariv. You recite the Havdalah in the makeup prayer, which is the second prayer. I see we have a few questions here. I don't know who's first. Ben?
Yeah. I wanted to know, so the only place in the Amida on Saturday night in Arvit that you say Abdallah is the Atachon Antanu? This is the addition that you do?
Yeah, it's called Atachon Antanu. Now we will see
the darker area.
The grade area, yeah. In a lot of Sidurim,
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the Havdalah that we're referring to, right? Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah, I didn't understand in your explanation. You said that if you're not making up, if you don't have wine until Sunday night, but if you didn't make Havdalah, how could you purchase wine?
So, first of all, a person can say Baruch Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'Choyel. You could recite the separation between Shabbos and weekday in words, and then you're allowed to do work. So you could say Baruch Hamavdil, but additionally, it could be that you recited the Havdalah in the prayer, and now you still want to get wine. So you recited it already in the prayer, the Atachon Antanu. So that also is just as good, maybe better, than the Baruch Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'Choyel recitation. Because here you actually said the main Havdalah, but you still are supposed to go after wine. You're supposed to try to get wine. And the only thing is, if you to a certain extent, we know that when the Jews were poor, they didn't go to get wine. So here also, if you're not going to be able to get wine then until Sunday night, so you wouldn't have to wait around and expect to get wine Sunday night or Monday. Instead, you're not going to get it all Sunday. That's it. Until Sunday night, you're exempt from the wine part. In other words, this would exempt you from the wine, the fact that you're not going to have it on Sunday.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yes.
Very hard for the monks.
Rabbi.
Before I answer your question, I just want to mention there is such an opinion that it goes until midday on Sunday, not until Sunday night. So I just want to clarify that. Yes, Moshe.
Is it Doraita, the drinking of the wine, or is it Rabbanan?
You tell me. What do you think?
I would think it's Rabbanan, because there was nothing that said in the Exodus that that wine was used, was it? I mean,
right. It makes sense that it should only be rabbinic. The question would be, if you did not recite any other Havdalah, if Havdalah is biblical and you did not recite the Havdalah in the prayer, so what would end up happening is that your Havdalah on the cup of wine, which normally is a rabbinic mitzvah, turns into a biblical mitzvah, because this is your Havdalah, the only Havdalah you're going to be reciting. So under normal circumstances, it would be rabbinic. But here, you didn't recite the Havdalah in the prayers, if a person didn't. And then when he recites the Havdalah on the cup of wine, it ends up a fulfillment of the biblical obligation. Again, he's not obligated to have a cup of wine biblically, but he ends up using that as his biblical, as the fulfillment of the biblical obligation to separate between Shabbos and the weekday.
I see.
Got it? Okay,
Yes.
good.
Thank you.
Yes, Susan. Susan?
One more question about the wine. When I would be with my grandfather and he would be doing all the blessings and prayers, he would put a little tiny, and I was little, put a little tiny glass of wine, and then we would take the pinky and with the wine and dab it onto a napkin. He wouldn't allow us to drink, myself and my three brothers. And whoever else, we were not allowed to drink it, but we were supposed to. Now, was that against the rules? Against the
There used to be. I've heard a superstition: if you drink the Havdalah wine, you grow a beard.
Ah! I don't have a beard, so I'm not worried. But I'm just.
That's because your grandfather made sure you didn't drink it.
That was the whole point. Oh, come on, that couldn't be. We were little kids.
But the thing is that, yeah, we don't drink the leftover wine from the Havdalah.
No, this wasn't leftover. We're sitting at the table with him and he's doing his morning prayers. He's wearing tefillin and everything. And we're sitting there when he does the wine. My grandmother.
Something's wrong. I'm sorry. I must have missed something in your story.
Never mind.
Havdalah is done Saturday night. You don't wear a tallis. You don't wear a tefillin. And the Abdullah prayer is Saturday night.
Okay, this was something different then. This was, I don't know what he was doing. Something different.
Now, the only time you wear a tallis for Havdalah is without no tefillin, but you would wear a tallis. Is a lot of people after Yom Kippur, they go home and they're still wearing their tallis.
Maybe that was
Yom Kippur night. They're wearing their tallis and they recite Havdalah. That's the only day that you're still wearing your tallis. At least some people are still wearing their tallis on Yom Kippur night. After Yom Kippur is over, and they do the Havdalah. Okay, in any event.
Or if her father was the chazan, the father davened Marav to be Yomid, he would have a tallis on and nobody else would.
In some shuls, Isaac. Not all shuls have a tallis.
True.
Right. Correct. Now, in the Shulchan Aruch here, in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, he continues, and he says that if a person made a mistake and forgot to recite the Havdalah in the prayer, so the law is you don't have to go back, but you need to recite it on a cup of wine, and you have fulfilled your obligation, except that you got to be careful not to do any work before you recite the Havdalah on the cup of wine, or at least say, Hamavdil ben kodesh l'choil. At least recite the separation between Shabbos and weekday. If you recite that, at least when you do work, you won't be transgressing because you've separated between the Shabbos, you've concluded the Shabbos, and then you would be allowed to do work. Now, what happens if you forgot and you did work in a prohibited manner, you worked, or if you tasted something before you recited Havdalah, you would need then to go back and daven again. And you're going to recite Havdalah on a cup of wine still as well, because you didn't recite it yet on the cup of wine. But since you messed up and you forgot it in the prayer, and you forgot it on the cup of wine because you ate something or you did work, a prohibited labor, without separating between Shabbos and weekday, so therefore you would need to repeat the Shemona Esrei. So that's I'm giving you a little understanding of what's our Gemara, how our Gemara translates into halacha, how it applies. and how it's brought down in the code of law. Now, if a person forgot to made a mistake, he missed out Havdalah in the prayer, he doesn't have a cup of wine, and he thinks that even tomorrow he's not going to have a cup of wine. So what does he do now? He didn't transgress anything except that he forgot to insert the Havdalah, but he didn't do work yet, and he didn't eat anything yet. What should he do now? So the law is he needs to repeat the Shemona Esrei, because he not going to want to fast until after tomorrow. No, tomorrow he's not expecting to get wine. So what are you going to say? Maybe on Tuesday morning he's going to get wine, but logically he's not going to want to fast until then. And if he does end up eating something before he gets his wine on Tuesday morning, he will not have fulfilled his obligation by that Havdalah that he recites on Tuesday morning because he ate something. And therefore, the law is that he should just repeat the Shemona Esrei at this point, and then he would be allowed to eat because he's not going to get wine until after sometime on Sunday. Now, there is one more law that I want to mention here, and then we'll go back to the Gemara. And the final law that I want to mention is that there is an option, according to some opinions, that in the Shemona Esrei, if you missed it out, the Havdalah, where you're supposed to insert it in the first blessing, there is an option to insert it in the Shomea Tefillah blessing, that in the final blessing of the 13 intermediate blessings of the Shemona Esrei, you would be allowed to insert the Havdalah, the Atachein Antanu part. There is an option to include it later on if you remembered. In other words, you forgot it initially, and then you remembered in the middle of the Shemona Esrei. So when you get up to Shemea Tefillah, the blessing, the final blessing of the intermediate blessings, there you would be able to insert the Havdalah. And there are different opinions about this. Can you rely on that or not? And the reason for the different opinions is this really a request, or is Havdalah more praise, not a request? And so that is what the debate is, and it's a discussion. Now, the conclusion that the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Alter Rebbe, ends off with is that a person who has a cup of wine, or someone who will get a cup of wine, even if he remembers to recite Havdalah in the Shemea Tefillah blessing, better not to recite it in the Shemea Tefillah blessing. But a person who doesn't expect to get any wine by the next day, and he will need to repeat the Shemona Esrei then, in that case, better he should rely on this view that you could recite the Havdalah in the Shemea Tefillah blessing and not to go back to the Atachoinen in order not to enter into blessings that are not necessary. So this combines our Gemara. It connects our point of not adding brachas that aren't necessary to this whole area of this whole issue of davening, missing Havdalah, and so on. So what comes out from this is that even though we always think that you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei if you miss the Havdalah part, it's not so true. There's sometimes you do have to repeat the Shemona Esrei if you miss the Havdalah. Now, I should also mention that I keep mentioning the word wine, that you need wine for the Havdalah. You don't necessarily need wine. there's something called Chamar Medina, which is something that's considered a honorable drink. If you don't have wine, you can use other drinks for wine, like coffee or some say Coke or orange juice. So there are other options.
Rebbe. Beer.
Beer, right?
Beer.
Is
We
very
always
common.
use beer.
Yes, beer is very common. Correct. I knew someone who used to use vodka for Havdalah, and then when he would stick the fire into it, it would be like a flambe. It would light up. But that's only one person I know.
That's not vodka. That's what my father called Zexanansiger.
Whatever, it's strong
96
stuff.
proof,
Right,
180 proof alcohol. Yep.
But I don't know if it has to be that. Vodka won't. I don't know if vodka will like, but it doesn't have to
You
be.
said flambe. Flambe. You take the 180 proof to get a nice flambe.
Right, but I don't know if it has to be that strong. You could get even less. 150 proof, I'm sure, could light up. I've seen much less than that light up, but I'm not sure if vodka would. I guess I'd have to try it. Okay. Anyway,
my father always went to Chicago. You couldn't get it in New York.
Illegal, huh? So, in any event, let's continue here with the Gemara. So we basically just finished this page 33a, and that if a person messed up, if he ate, he would need to repeat the Shemoneh Esrei, or if he did a malacha in a prohibited way that he didn't separate between Shabbos and weekday, you would have to repeat the Shemoneh Esrei. So this is an interesting halacha that many people aren't aware of, that if you missed out in Atachon Antanu, there are scenarios where a person would need to repeat the Shemoneh Esrei. Now, the Gemara asks now on page 33b, what happens if a person does recite the Havdalah in the prayer? Are you supposed to again recite it on a cup of wine? And this is really what the question of the Gemara is we just heard that maybe it's called a bracha she'eina tzricha. It's like a bracha that's not necessary. That's what the Gemara is thinking, that, we just heard such a thought. On the other hand, the Amoraim, the later rabbis, seem to say that you need to do both. So on the one hand, we had that brisa that we explained meant that you don't need to do both, and then it would be a bracha she'eina tzricha. And then we had a opinion of the Amoraim, a few opinions, where they said that you do need to recite both. So the Gemara is asking, again, we learned the Shulchan Aruch, don't let that confuse you. We read the Code of Law, which is the final conclusion. But now we're going back to the Gemara, and the Gemara is in the midst of making a decision. What do you do? Are you obligated to do it both? And the Gemara's conclusion is it's just like Kiddush. Just like Kiddush, even though you recited Kiddush in your prayer, you still recite it on a cup of wine when you get home. So also Havdalah, even though you recited Havdalah in the prayers, you recite it again at home on a cup of wine. So that's the conclusion. You recite it both, and it's obviously not considered a bracha she'eina tzricha. It's not a bracha that's not necessary. It is necessary. The rabbis established it and obligated it, and this is how you recite Havdalah both parts of Havdalah. The Gemara continues, and that's where we'll start now. We're 4 lines from the top of the page on 33b. 33b, 4 lines, the 4th line. Rabbi Eliezer says that you should recite Havdalah, the Atachon Antanu, not like we do it in the Atachonin blessing, in the first blessing. He says you should recite it in the Haida'ah, in the praise, the blessings of praise, of thanks, in the blessings of thanks, Haida'ah. And the Gemara says, Reb Zera Havarachiv Chamara. Reb Zera was riding on a donkey. Hava Kashokil V'Yazil. He was going. And it's interesting language. Shakil, taking and going. What does it mean? He was taking and going. So it could mean he was involved in learning, talking and learning. Shakil v'azel means he was debating. He was thinking about his learning back and forth. But in any event, it means he was going. Have a kashakil v'azel Reb Chia bar Avin basrei. Reb Chia bar Avin was going after him, and Amar lei. So Reb Zera told Reb Chia bar Avin, Vadai. Vadai, is it true? The Amriso Mishmeid Rabbi Yochanan, what they say in what you say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, halacha to Rabbi Eliezer, that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer b'yom tov shechal liyos achar Shabbos, on a yom tov that falls after Shabbos. Is that true that we follow Rabbi Eliezer's view? So let me explain what we're talking about here. We mentioned that the Havdalah that we recite in the prayer is in the first intermediary blessing of the Shemona Esrei, which means blessing number 4. In blessing number 4, we insert a paragraph called Atochin Antanu, and that fits in the Atochinin blessing. The problem is on Yontiv that falls after Shabbos. So let's say there's a holiday that falls Saturday night. You're not reciting the weekday Shemona Esrei on a holiday. You recite the holiday Shemona Esrei. Now, if you're reciting the holiday Shemona Esrei, where do you insert the Atochen Antanu? There's no blessing of knowledge that night. The blessing of knowledge, where it's really supposed to fit, you don't have it there. So where does it belong? Now, Rabbi Eliezer had a view that you insert it in the blessing of Haida'ah by the Moedim, in the blessing of thanks to God. That's where you're supposed to insert the Atochin Antanu. Now, on the holidays, you do recite that. So the Gemara is thinking, and this is what Reb Chia bar Abba, Reb Zera is asking Reb Chia bar Abba. He's asking him that, is it true what they say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that you are supposed to follow Rabbi Eliezer on such a day? Because we can't do what we normally do that day, like we follow the first opinion in the Mishnah, which is the Tanakama. That there's no option. Havdalah is in Chein Adas. There's no Chein Adas blessing on Saturday night. That's a holiday. So what do you do? So he's wondering, is it true that we're supposed to follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, which there is a Haidah, there is a Moedim on the holidays that are the holiday Shemona Esrei, and therefore maybe we're supposed to follow that view. Yes, Ben.
Is that which of the are we talking about? Is that the one right before Modim?
Yeah, Modim, yeah.
Or before, not at the end of the Shemona Esrei?
Well, the last 3 brachas are called Haidah. The last 3 blessings.
So after the last 3, it would be Sim Shalom, wouldn't it?
But
Not
here
before.
it says, in the Haidah. In the Haidah, you insert. Rabbi Eliezer said that you insert the prayer of Atochin Antanu in the Haidah. So it would simply mean right next to Moedim.
So you would say Modim Anachnu, and after that you say Atachon Antanu?
You know, it's a little unclear. It's a little unclear what exact point he's referring to. Again, we don't follow this. But
we don't
in the
follow
bracha of Moedim. Now,
I think right before Sim Shalom is also Odaha.
It's all part of Haidah. All three blessings. It's a little vague what his opinion exactly is. What he does hold is it definitely doesn't belong in the request blessings. because it's not a request, it's praise
Okay.
of Hashem. But
So somewhere between
you
Modin
should
and Sim
include it.
Shalom.
Right. But it doesn't say clearly where it's supposed to be inserted. So maybe right after Maidim, maybe right before Maidim, in the bracha maybe in the bracha of the Sechazena Einenu, maybe in that bracha. It's a little vague. It doesn't say. We don't follow this. Again, we're talking about a minority view that's not followed at all. But I didn't see any commentary that says exactly where Rabbi Eliezer holds it has to be. But in any event, the Gemara is wondering if we follow Rabbi Eliezer on a holiday, when a holiday falls Saturday night.
Okay.
So the Gemara says, Amar Le, Reb Chia bar Oven answered Reb Zera in yes, that you do follow Rabbi Eliezer on a Saturday night. So the Gemara says, halacha, when Rabbi Chia bar Oven, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he used the word halacha, that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer. Halacha mechlal de pligi. When you say the halacha follows someone, you're implying like there are others that argue. But on a Saturday night, that's a holiday, no one argues. Everyone would seem to agree because there's no other option. So the Gemara says, really? No one argues? V'loi pligi? V'ha pligi rabbanon. What do you mean? The rabbis argue on Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, no, they argue only on a regular weekend. Amar de pligi rabbanon b'shayim hashana, they argue on a regular other days of the year. B'yom dev shcholi achar Shabbos, achar Shabbos, mi pligi, do the rabbis argue? Everyone agrees. But the Gemara says, no, but Rabbi Akiva argues. Well, Polig Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara is bothered with, why did we say the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer when there's no such, you don't use that term, halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer, unless there's people who argue. And here we're dealing with a Saturday night that's a holiday. And in this scenario, no one argues. So the Gemara says, oh, no one argues, but Rabbi Akiva argues because he would say that you just make your own blessing. You make a blessing in its own right. And he would hold even on a holiday that falls on a Saturday night that you would recite a blessing like he, and he would argue on Rabbi Eliezer. You don't include it in the Haidah. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, you're going to consider his view considered a eligible view to say we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer against Rabbi Akiva. Do we all year round follow Rabbi Akiva? The hashta neki neko v'navid kavasei, that now we would have a thought that to follow him. So if so, why would you say the term halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer when there's no reason there's no other option? So the Gemara answered, Kol hashana kula my taima loyavdinan Rabbi Akiva. Whole year round, why don't we follow Rabbi Akiva? Because the Tamne, the Gemara explains, actually, the Gemara is now explaining why this is so, that we don't follow Rabbi Akiva at all. Because the same logic that we don't follow him during the year, we're not going to follow him if a holiday falls on Saturday night. Because Kol hashana kula my taima loyavdinan, all year round, what's the reason we don't follow Rabbi Akiva like the opinion of Rabbi? Why don't we follow him? Because Tmane Sri Tikkun, because the rabbis established 18 blessings. Shasrei Loi Tikkun, they did not establish 19 blessings. So Hachanami here also on a Saturday night, that's a holiday, which we would recite 7 blessings on holidays. It says Shev Tikkun, 7 they established. Tamne Loi Tikkun, but 8 they didn't establish. So therefore, there's no reason to even think that we should follow anyone but Rabbi Eliezer. So that's what the Gemara is asking. Why would you use the term halacha? You should use a different term. So Amar le Reb Chia bar Ravin said to Reb Zera that it's true. Lav halacha itmar, ela matin itmar. It's not really halacha like Rabbi Eliezer, but we lean towards Rabbi Eliezer.